Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to the Costs of War and the Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Term Future seminar. And what we're going to do today is hear from Ben Suitt, who's a PhD candidate who actually successfully defended his dissertation not too long ago. His topic today is suicide among post-9/11 service members and veterans. He wants to help us understand the rates and their causes. This is a continuation of the theme we started last week with Ken McLeish, and we follow on Thursday, April 29th with another seminar with Linda Bilmes from Harvard University. Hers is Veterans of the Post-9/11 Wars, the Long-Term Costs of America's Promise to Those Who Serve. Now, today, Dr. Suitt, maybe one of the first to call you that, will be talking for about 30 minutes. And then if you'd like to, please send your questions in. And if they're answered in the course of the talk, we don't have to use them. But please go ahead and write your questions into the format that's available to you. And I will ask those questions as we go along. So take it away.
Thank you, Nita, for that introduction and for moderating today. And to all those working with the Cost of War Project and John Quindato and the Pardee Center for hosting this webinar and giving me the opportunity to speak. I feel very lucky to be here. Also, thank you to everyone joining us today. I hope you're well wherever you are. Good afternoon. The talk I'm giving today is based on my forthcoming paper with the Cost of War Project. It'll be called High Suicide Rates Among United States Service Members and Veterans of the Post-9/11 Wars. Basically, what we will talk about today are the often hidden costs of war, the mental health costs of war. And primarily, we are going to focus on the climbing suicide rates of post-9/11 service members and veterans, as well as potential causes for those climbing rates. As we will see and discuss, the number of post-9/11 veterans and active duty personnel that have died by suicide has far exceeded the 7,056 troops who died in military operations in the War on Terror. Such a realization ought to shock us and reveal that our military and American society more broadly have failed to manage the mental health costs of the War on Terror. Now, a little bit about me, just briefly. I am a PhD candidate in the graduate program in religion here at Boston University. And my research focuses on the sociology of religion in the US military, particularly in uncovering the role of religion in the lives of service members and veterans. A large part of that scholarship and my work is understanding trauma, including post-traumatic stress, moral injury, and other manifestations of trauma in the lives of service members and veterans. And of course, this includes suicidal ideation and its associated potential causes, which brings us to this presentation in the forthcoming paper. At the outset here, I do wish to note that this talk will focus in detail on the ways service members and veterans face hardship and mental illness that may lead to suicide. I will include information about resources for service members and veterans at the end of the presentation, but I just wanted to note that I will be talking about difficult content. I should note that the veterans emphasized here represent an alarming portion, but a non-majority of service members and veterans. And I do not wish to reinforce any sorts of stereotypes of veterans that mark them as mentally broken or inherently at risk. To begin, in a recent survey of over 1,700 veteran members of Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, 67% of veterans knew a post-9/11 veteran who had attempted suicide, while 62% knew a veteran who had successfully committed suicide. The point is, suicide among post-9/11 veterans is a serious problem that demands investigation. Obviously, the Office of Veterans Affairs, the VA, and the Department of Defense, the DoD, care a great deal about this issue and have poured resources into combating it. But the problem seems to be getting worse, not better, and I will discuss why that may be in a moment. Now, determining the exact number for suicides among service members and veterans can be challenging. Not only is data limited and measured inconsistently over time, although it has gotten much better since about 2011, it is difficult to determine what is and isn't a suicide in general. if you think about it this way, to talk of suicide is to do a bit of forensic analysis, often without the actual context and certainly without the thoughts someone had leading to the event. More than that, there simply cannot be one root cause for why suicide rates are getting worse. It's a very complex issue. And indeed, they're getting worse for civilians as well. So we can expect that, like the general population rate, that it would be getting worse for veterans and service members. And likely many factors contribute to that, and this will all require complex solutions. Consider even that the experiences of someone in the Army would be vastly different than those of someone in the Air Force, and they would be different between officers and enlisted and active and reserve components and so on. However, despite that difficulty of determining a potential cause of increased suicide rates, a difficulty the Department of Defense acknowledges, it is worth speculating, particularly regarding what may be novel about the global war on terror. The growing crisis is especially pressing because veterans of post-9/11 conflicts are disproportionately dying by suicide compared to previous military service eras. There are clear contributors to suicidal ideation, like high exposure to trauma, particularly mental trauma, physical, moral, and sexual traumas, stress and burnout, the influence of the military's masculine culture that often denies help-seeking attitudes among active service members, and that follows into the lives of veterans as well, continued access to guns and other lethal means, and the difficulty of civilian sector reintegration. Of course, those factors may be true of all wars, so we must also consider what might be novel about the war on terror, which I will get into after we go over some rates. So I will first go over the trends and rates to give you a sense of the problem here. I will then explore the potential novel causes for increased suicide, and then the causes that may be true of warfare in general. So this chart combines a lot of different information, and so I'm going to actually break it down, but just briefly looking at this, I guess we can say that there's basically two categories of rates. There's the veteran suicide rates and then the active duty suicide rates. And so I'm going to focus first here on the veteran rates. So this is the veteran suicide rate compared to the age-adjusted, and this actually also the gender-adjusted or sex-adjusted civilian suicide rate as well. And the blue line is the adjusted, so age and sex, being adjusted for. This blue line is the rate, and we can see that it is quite a bit higher than the civilian rate. And just, I guess, actually here at the beginning, I should note that a veteran is defined in the rates. These are rates supplied by the VA. A veteran is defined as someone who has been activated for federal service and was not currently serving at the time of death. So sort of missing here might be some reserve and National Guard that were never federally activated, and then this does not include active duty personnel. And that point about determining who was federally activated actually means that some of this data might be prone to error. So the 2020 annual report documents that 6,399 veteran suicides occurred in 2017. In the 2019 report, that was at a lower 6,139. So it would probably be within a couple hundred, but it's still important to realize that the data might not always be accurate. Just if you're wondering here, so this adjusted rate, the blue line, where we are at the most recent data that was released, that's 2018, the rate is 27.5, which is it's 1.5 times the rate provided here in 2005. So it has been going steadily up and at a steeper incline, we can see, than the civilian rate. One important thing to realize here is that these veteran rates include all veterans, and the VA, when they release the data, they don't sort of specify what era the veterans are from. They do break it down by age. And so we can probably reasonably say that the 18 to 34 age demographic over the years would largely be post 9/11 veterans. It might be a mix sort of in the 2005 era, but certainly today that would all be include post 9/11 veterans. And so if we add in a line here for the rates among 18 to 34 service members, or veterans, excuse me, we see it's at a much, much steeper incline. And so from 2005 to 2018, we've seen a 76% increase over that period. And the most recent rate provided by, again, the 2018 data release was 45.9 per 100,000 in 2018. So even only counting the 9,962 veterans who died by suicide in this sort of 18 to 34 range between 2005 and 2018, and remember that's missing, obviously some data before 2005 and then the most recent years, and missing those in the 35 to 55 or 55 plus categories. We can see that that's nearly already double the number of hostile deaths from the war on terror, which again, that number for hostile deaths that I had on a higher slide is 5,462. So factoring all of the sort of post 9/11 veterans in the 35 to 55 range or the 55 plus range, we can begin to see that a conservative estimate here would likely be between 20,370 to about 22,261. And I should add that that is a conservative estimate, and in consideration that only about 21% of current U.S. military veterans served in the war on terror, but also in sight of that significantly higher rate among young veterans. So again, I think, yeah, in this sort of conservative estimate, it looks like approximately between 20,370 and 22,261 post 9/11 veterans have died by suicide. Moving now to the active duty rates, I did want to sort of bring in this particular graph here to show the hostile death rate. This is based on hostile deaths versus the per 100,000 based on the size of the force at the time. And this is really here to point out that in about 2012, we can begin to see when just the amount of service members who have died in combat sort of flipped with the amount of service members dying every year due to suicide. And so as the war has continued for now nearly 20 years, we can see that obviously we're experiencing far fewer combat deaths, but the suicide rates among active duty service members represented by this orange and blue line has continued to go up. And I should note, well, let me move on to this chart, removing the hostile death rate and talking here, showing the civilian rate, again, age adjusted. And here the orange line is the crude rate. So that's just actual, like the rate per 100,000, but adjusting for age and sex, this blue line that really picks up in 2011. We can see that and the DoD will double down on this, and it's in the reports that the suicide rate among active duty personnel tends to be about the same as the civilian rate. What isn't often mentioned is that the historic rate tended to be lower than the civilian rate. And so that it has matched, and in recent data, although they haven't released new rates since the 2018 year, it does look like it may be trending to be even higher than civilian rate. So that should be alarming based on the fact that the rate, even adjusted, or even crude, excuse me, used to be much lower than the civilian rate. Okay. And I also wanted to point out, so the DoD's Executive Director of Force Resiliency, Elizabeth P. Van Winkle, explained in 2019 that while the military holds itself to a higher standard than the civilian population, they're often asked how they compare, and she indicated that, again, in the 2018 report, that suicide rates for active component and reserve members were comparable to the US population rates after accounting for age and sex. And I just wanted to have that direct quote just so I'm covering my bases on the DoD does tend to say that they're comparable to the civilian rate. And there is more recent data. They do quarterly reports on active duty and reserve suicides, and they just haven't released the rates yet. So we can see from the quarterly reports that the total number of veterans, of service members, active service members dying each year has been increasing. 18 was higher than 2017, 2019 is higher than 2018, and 2020 is now, that was recently released in the fourth quarter report, was higher than 2019. And just so we have a sense of scale here, the 2018 rate for active duty service members was at 19 per 100,000. And one thing sort of missing from here, I should say, is that this is the active component of the military. So this does not include reservists and National Guard. And so if we were to look at the reservist sort of rate over time, it would look fairly similar to the active duty suicide rate. However, the National Guard rate is higher. So this sort of brown line here is the National Guard rate that's been, that was provided with the accurate rates since 2011. And we can see it's much higher. It's not totally clear why the National Guard has a much higher rate than active duty or reserve components, but it's worth just seeing here that higher rate, at least as of 2018, was at 30.6 per 100,000. So even if you count all of the deaths in the war and terror, that's both hostile, as in combat, and non-hostile, which could be car accidents or succumbing to the environment or anything like that, that total is 7,056. We can see that if even counting that, there are more than triple the number of post-9/11 veteran suicide deaths. And when we add in what I estimate to be about 5,116 active duty personnel who have died by suicide since the beginning of the war on terror, 377 of which was in 2020 alone, and adding in the National Guard, which would be about 1,193 service members who died by suicide, and the 1,607 reserve component service members who died by suicide, and those are just between 2011 and 2020, we can see that the numbers are incredibly devastating. The fact of the matter is that we do have a suicide crisis among our troops and veterans, and something has to change. Inside of that reality, we have to look at what may be causing these alarmingly high rates, so we can begin to think about the sorts of changes that could make a difference. So first, we'll look at what could be unique factors contributing to suicide during the post-9/11 wars, and then we'll explore factors that likely are true of war in general. One thing, and it's sort of, we've already sort of seen it over the graph with the hostile death rates, is that the protracted length of the war may be contributing, even though the combat deaths are significantly lower. We can see that the suicide rates continue to climb. This is actually a bit unusual because apart from Vietnam, in the history of the United States, the suicide rates during wartime tend to go down. So in both Vietnam and now the war on terror, suicide rates among service members have climbed. And the sort of effects of the protracted length of the war may influence these upcoming factors as well. But one of the issues too with the protracted length is that public opinion and general disinterest in the war has become a bit of an issue. So the public approval of combat operations in Iraq declined from 71% in 2003 to 43% in 2018. Over half of American citizens and almost 60% of veterans do not think the US has clear strategic objectives in Afghanistan, with even more believing the war has not been a success. And adding to that, a poll in 2018 found that about 42% of American voters were either unaware of the continuing conflicts in the Middle East or convinced that the war on terror was over. And so when veterans or when service members transition to become veterans, or even when service members come home between deployments, this sort of disinterest among the public may contribute to the sort of feelings that that service members and veterans can develop of a sense of purposelessness, which can, or that what they're doing, it doesn't matter. And this can lead to depression or other issues that then lead to suicidal ideation. And sort of contributing to this, and just to sort of tie this back to what Ken McLeish spoke about last week, is we have sort of this veteran stereotype that can also exacerbate this issue. And so this idea that veterans are simultaneously set apart as moral exemplars, but then also simultaneously somehow broken or dangerous. And so mixing these together, this apparent disinterest in the war and the sacrifice veterans made for our country not being properly honored, and that these stereotypes set them apart, but also characterize them as broken. These can exacerbate this lack of feeling of belonging and enhance feelings of purposelessness or burdensomeness that can then lead to suicidal ideation. And then sort of in addition to that, we've had obviously these remarkable advances in technology and medicine over the last 20 years. And what this means is that many more service members are able to survive after sort of experiencing a wound or other traumas in service. But what that also means is that the military will then redeploy them. And so at least a third of previously injured service members redeploy at least once, if not many more times, after surviving an initial injury. And that sort of leads into the next piece here, which is the one thing that has really characterized the war on terror has been it was novel sort of towards the beginning of the war, and now is very commonplace, but the use of IEDs, or improvised explosive devices. And it's sort of become so commonplace that it leads to stress among young service members. Many older service members have experienced IEDs multiple times, and sort of the signature injury of what's been called the signature injury of the war on terror, and what is a common byproduct of experiencing the effects of an IED explosion is traumatic brain injuries, or minor traumatic brain injuries. And between 8 and 20% of military personnel have experienced traumatic brain injuries. In a study of over 150 military personnel serving in Iraq in 2009, the average number of traumatic brain injuries per person was over 2, with the highest being reported at 18. And the research then found that the traumatic brain injuries increased the service members' risk of suicide with a much higher frequency, correlating a higher frequency of traumatic brain injuries correlating with a higher risk of suicide. And sort of going deeper into that literature, you can sort of imagine that an injury from an improvised explosive device might come with more than just a traumatic brain injury. And so there is sort of this way to describe that, which is polytrauma, which is a combination of sort of trauma, but that can be physical or mental sort of in combination. And so what's been called the clinical triad, but the most common polytrauma among service members is traumatic brain injury, then chronic pain, and then developing post-traumatic stress, which is a sort of physiological response to trauma. And so looking at these seem to be sort of what would be the unique factors about the war on terror that increase the potential for suicide rates to go up. And then looking at what may be sort of common for war in general, obviously traumatic experience is going to be just a part of being in war, and part of experiencing trauma may be the development of post-traumatic stress. And between 11 and 20% of veterans are diagnosed with PTS. And, that includes sort of, having this fight or flight response constantly triggered. It can have issues of re-experiencing trauma, nightmares, and other related issues. In addition to that, we have what has come to be called moral injury, which is this betrayal of a sense of right. Typically, that could be because you personally felt as though you did something against what your conscience would have you do. Like it challenges your sense of that you're a good person, but it could also be a sense of betrayal from, say, the military organization or from a superior officer, with things like that. And there isn't great data on sort of how common moral injury is, because there isn't an agreed upon diagnostic for this, but about 27% of service members in the theater of war faced ethical situations during deployment in which they did not know how best to respond. So if you're imagining about a quarter of service members experiencing ethical dilemmas and not knowing how to respond, and how that might then sort of lead to a sense of moral injury later. And then military sexual trauma that includes sexual trauma in the context of the military, including rape and violence, which affects about 23% of women in the military, and that rate or that amount might actually be significantly underreported. And then, of course, in terms of just sexual harassment broadly, that affects about 55% of women in the military and 38% of men. And again, those might be significantly underreported. And then just broadly speaking, in terms of other mental health concerns, you could have depression, you might have childhood trauma, and sort of other things that might be contributing to suicide rates among service members and veterans. And then one sort of bigger issue is access to lethal means, and that's both on the part of service members and as they become veterans. But about 65% of active military suicides involve a firearm, and among veterans, it's a little bit higher. It's just under 70%. And compared to the 48% among the general population, that is significantly higher. So it's something to think about. And then just finally, the difficulty of civilian reintegration. The study I mentioned earlier, done by veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, found that 40% of post-9/11 veterans reported facing challenges upon transitioning. And so just sort of the loss of status one might feel, the sort of difficulty of reintegrating into civilian culture after being in the military, and other related issues like that can contribute to suicidal ideation. And so looking at all of these together, and there's obviously much more besides, if I were to give you some takeaways from this presentation, it would be to see that roughly about 5,100 active duty service members have likely died by suicide since the war on terror began. Among post-9/11 veterans, it looks like about 22,260 or more veterans have died by suicide. And together we can see that is more than triple the number of those who have died just in military operations broadly. And we must do something to help our troops and veterans, whatever they may look like. And I'm happy actually to talk about that a bit in the questions coming up as well. And so here at the end, I do want to put this up, just if any of the things I talked about affect you or a veteran or service member you know, there are resources available, including this hotline. And these are my references. Thank you so much. I'm happy now to turn it over to Q&A.
Well, that was a very sobering presentation, and I'm sure that when people write in their questions, there'll be many. But I just wanted to ask you if you could go a little bit deeper into something technical, and then I want to ask a more broad question. You're saying that the military is telling us that the suicide rates aren't as high, either in active duty and veterans, as they might be, right? So you see a discrepancy between what you think is true and what they're saying. Is that right?
Depending, but it's also it's specific to how they did data collection, and so some of this is me having to sift through a lot of different sources for data to sort of piece it together. So they even thinking about, say, active duty in terms of defining the denominator of who counts in the totals for active component, reserves, and National Guard. It looks like they didn't really get consistency on that until about 2008, and then they didn't really start implementing that until 2011. So you'll see on that chart I had earlier that a lot of the data that I show sort of starts at 2011, and that's me saying like this is where the data then becomes consistent, because before that it's sort of do I count self-inflicted? How do I compare it to suicide among active duty year to year? But I don't know exactly if those denominators match up, and so this is a bit of estimating, but it certainly hasn't been reported in full. And part of that too is, say, on the VA side, that they don't designate between times of service. It's just sort of by age or sex. So it's difficult to figure out. And I mean, all of this data is readily available. It just hasn't really been presented in this way. And if the Department of Defense says, hey, look, this is very much like the civilian rate, it sounds like, oh, it must not be that big of a deal, but they don't sort of then double down on the fact that it tends to be lower than the civilian rate, and now that it's matching or going higher.
Right. So this gets to the deeper question I wanted to ask, because from what I understand, reading the reports by the DoD and the Veterans Administration, it seemed to me, especially around 2010-11, that both the active duty side and the veterans were focused on the problem of suicide. It seemed to me that their attention turned and they threw a lot of resources to that problem. Yet what you're showing is two things. One is sort of an unwillingness to acknowledge the problem. I'm not sure why in its full extent. And then also the fact that even despite all these resources, it doesn't seem to have made much difference. Right. So I remember they took a high general who had been commanding in Iraq and put him in charge of suicide prevention. Right. That's how high of a priority it seems. So can you explain or comment on why you think there's such a disconnect?
So I don't know exactly why the resources have not worked. There are certain factors, like they did begin to screen service members before they went on deployments, and upon returning back, they do it in between missions. But then data shows that about 40% or less of service members answer those questions honestly, and there's a good reason to like it makes sense why they would do that. They don't want to be flagged and then told that they can't deploy, especially if they've sort of viewed the military as their career. And so, being exposed to a traumatic brain injury or developing PTSD is like a terrible inconvenience when you're trying to sort of stick to your career. But unfortunately, what we're seeing is that those very things, surviving multiple traumatic brain injuries or developing PTSD, among, so many other factors, make suicide worse. And I would speculate that a big issue is just the sheer length of the war. And there's so many things to cover here too. One of the things that I think is important too is, because I might be presenting this in a certain way, but it does look like people that do not experience combat but are in the service do have sort of higher rates of suicide. So just sort of this broad feeling that maybe being in combat would make it more likely that you would develop suicidal ideation. That's not necessarily the case. There are many other kinds of trauma, including military sexual trauma. But there's also reason to believe that sort of just being involved in violence at all is a contributor. And so whether or not you're in the theater of war, you might have, you might develop trauma or other sort of issues that would lend itself to you having suicidal ideation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have a question about solutions, but before we get to your solutions, could you just say a little bit more about the difference between men and women? And I know you're deep into this, but you alluded to that with the sexual harassment and sexual trauma, but are the suicide rates correlated with that?
So the suicide rates among women are higher for women in the military than for civilians, and so at a much, a big difference, but they are lower than men. And it seems like the most common sort of indicator if you're going to have a higher suicidal ideation rate or suicide rate is that you are a young white man. That could be just because that's the largest population in the military, but there is research looking at that. But you are right to point out that there may be something very specific to military sexual trauma and the experiences of women, that their rate is much higher than that of civilians. And I would have to find that exact sort of data for you, but that is certainly the case.
Okay, thank you. And so would you say a little bit more about solutions, the ones that have worked, perhaps?
Sure, I can talk about, this seems like a two-parter, so I could talk about what the Department of Defense and the Veterans Affairs Office have done, and then sort of what more could be done. When looking at Department of Defense spending on suicide prevention, it looks like a raindrop in the ocean of defense spending. They get to put about $20 million a year towards it. And what they use that $20 million for is mostly, depending on the administration, mostly to run the hotline. So one source is the current name of the hotline they use for veterans. And in addition to that, they may use it for sort of predictive modeling or focusing on the lethal means issue. But the main thing is the hotline. But to say that that is $20 million sort of set aside specifically for suicide prevention, but that would do the military a disservice to act as though that's the only way they're attacking it. They do have lots of different programs. They do rely heavily on the military chaplaincy for counseling. They do have just general counselors and also social workers to work with service members. And then they have, and it's sort of different between branch to branch, but they have the resilience training program, which is designed to help service members be more resilient to the factors that, what they may face in the theater of war. So I do think all of those things support suicide prevention. They just might not be called that. And then on the VA side, they have put quite a bit of money into it. So $10.2 billion in 2021 for suicide prevention. And so there is, arguably there's more of an emphasis on sort of the back end once you become a veteran rather than, preventing it on the front end, but it is something to consider. And so then that $10.2 billion goes towards all sorts of programs and predictive modeling, and I'd say most of it goes to just giving access to veterans to mental health care workers, and making those connections. But I mean, they do outreach programs and phone calls, and yeah, the VA does a lot of work, and there's exceptions here and there, but
Great, thank you. So there's a question about different modalities of treatment. One is about the potential use of psychedelics like LSD for PTSD. And I have a couple of other treatments that I'm wondering about, which often aren't paid for, like EMDR and neurofeedback. Do you know anything about those? Or the psychedelics?
only that I've seen that the sort of scholarly work coming in on that are promising. I think I mean, apart from listening to some podcasts or seeing those papers come forward, I haven't looked a lot into sort of psychedelics, but I do know that that is a sort of a new frontier that is being taken seriously, which has big implications not just for the military but for the public at large. That it does seem to have a big difference in sort of resetting the brain in such a way that it would reduce depression, if not, stop it from happening. So, yeah, the VA is certainly constantly working on new ways to approach the issue. One thing to keep in mind too here, though, is that the VA is vast, and it could be different from VA hospital to VA hospital and who works there. And again, if you consider the CARE Act, that veterans can now sort of go outside of network, I'm really speaking in broad strokes when I say that, they're looking at LSD or things like that. I'm sure that's very specific to specific regions and doctors.
Okay, thank you. And about those other treatments like EMDR or neurofeedback, do you know anything about those?
I don't.
Okay. From my understanding, there's that some of these treatments, especially neurofeedback, have actually advanced in the study of veterans or treatment of veterans, and then trickled out into the general population. So I wondered if you could comment on that.
If I knew more about those specific treatments, I would love to. But
it's okay. And we have another question about putting the post 9/11 veterans in a larger context. And this is a question that asks, this person's seeing a much higher number for veteran suicide. And they say more suicide deaths than all Vietnam combat deaths. Now, Vietnam combat deaths were about 55,000. So I don't think that's quite right. You've got a number here that doesn't add up to that.
No, I do want to double down that the estimate I gave is a conservative one. And again, that 22,000-ish that I gave was specifically for active component post 9/11 veterans. So if you add to that the more than 5,000 active component who died, and the nearly, I guess it's a little more than 1,500 for reserve and National Guard, it is very high. It's nowhere near the 50, but that doesn't mean that I'm the final word on this. I'm trying to give what I think is a realistic and conservative picture.
That's right. But what you are saying is that of the approximately 5,000 or so people who died in the field in the post 9/11 wars, either killed in action or by accident or some other cause, that many more have died from suicide.
Vastly more, yes.
Yes, many more, multiples of. And I think that I don't know if you can answer this question, but is that unusual historically? I think that's also implied by this question. Can you say that's something that's a late 20th century or early 21st century artifact?
So there is a recent publication by Smith and others. It's 2019, but they did, this is specific for the Army, but they did a report for suicides from the early 1800s to today. And what they found is you can sort of see it as two periods. There's pre-World War II and the sort of post-World War II. And pre-World War II, the suicide rates among service members per 100,000, remember, is that they were much higher than they are today. But the size of the military was much smaller. The way they reported it is obviously incredibly inconsistent, nor did they know really the right vocabulary for how to speak about mental health in the same way that we do today. But just from the data that was shown, it does look that prior to World War II, particularly in peacetime, the suicide rate among active Army personnel was higher at times than it is today. Then after World War II, that was not the case. Now we are certainly higher than any time since World War II. Another important thing stemming from that data is that even before World War II, generally speaking, the suicide rate among service members would fall during wartime, or be about the same. So the Vietnam War was the first time where we saw that not to be the case, and now the War on Terror has also followed that. So whether that is due to the length or the unpopularity or other issues like that, it's hard to say, but that should give you some sort of sense of the history there.
That's very helpful. Now, I was reading, I read a couple memoirs. I usually just try to read science fiction, but I read every now and then memoirs of veterans. And I can say that a thread of some of them has been self-medicating, sort of self-medicating with alcohol and other drugs. And I wonder if you found anything about that. In other words, that suicide isn't the only major mental health problem here, along with PTSD, but what you're seeing about alcohol and drug use.
Yes, so self-medicating with alcohol and drugs, and also just dangerous behaviors like driving really quickly or doing things that could put you in physical danger. All of those are contributing factors to higher suicidal ideation and potentially suicide rates. And also that is a problem, whether or not suicide comes into the picture. That is certainly a problem, not just among veterans, but in the military itself. And so if we looked at even just the non-hostile deaths in the War on Terror, it's almost nearly 2/3 of it is from car accidents. And that likely is, it's not from an explosion. The non-hostile deaths are from other things that may be tied to drunk driving or purposeful speeding, things like that.
Right. So what you're pointing out is a force in distress. Yeah, and a veteran population in distress. Now, if you were asked to, say what the priorities should be, I know that if we could move on to your dissertation for a moment. This may not be fair, but you mentioned in your talk the chaplains and other personnel are taking up the job of counseling. So could you say something about that, the role of the ministry here to help people so that they're not reckless, not misusing drugs, and not taking their own lives?
Yes, I could talk at length for a very long time. I'll try to keep it short, but certainly chaplains have been a part of the military since the military existed here in the United States, and they have taken on the role of not just sort of religious counselors, but counselors more broadly, and also sort of educators on ethics. And they certainly work with service members, even non-religious service members, to sort of help them in times of distress and more besides. The military does have counselors and social workers that are not just the amount of them is not as great as the number of military chaplains, but those resources do exist as well. And obviously a big part of the work of the VA is connecting veterans with mental health care workers specifically, and also chaplains. But yes, so religion has a complicated role to play in sort of mitigating mental health issues. On the one hand, it could be extremely helpful, and there's plenty of literature to say even during the service, but particularly after the service, religious resources can be a way to sort of mitigate trauma and help you become a part of a new community or reframe experience in a positive way. But it's important to also see that religion could be the thing that sort of exacerbates trauma, particularly if it feels as though, if it leads to this, what I mentioned briefly, moral injury, this feeling of doing something against what is right. So it breaks this narrative that I'm a good person. And if religion sort of tells you that, killing is wrong, and then you kill someone, you might have that sort of religious part of you might actually make your trauma worse. And then there's much more here too, just in terms of the role of chaplains and how they frame traumatic experience among service members, but they do play a significant and supportive role. Yes.
Right. Then in a sense, I wonder if it's just more cost effective to increase resources for chaplains, or if you disagree.
I don't think that military chaplains are going anywhere, and they do have a significant, foothold and place in all of the military, whether that's education or counseling or leading worship or speaking at engagements. And it does appear that the military does reinforce and emphasize the military chaplaincy more than, say, social work and just broad mental health counseling. But I don't want to mischaracterize and act as if those things don't exist. It's just that the military chaplaincy is the more significant proponent that handles sort of counseling, and then also the chaplaincy continues to grow in size.
Right. Maybe Ben, you could say a few things about the culture in general, though, and the sort of masculine ideal that you're not to show weakness. And what we read in the newspaper is that people don't want to report, as you've already discussed, they don't want to report possible side effects of a traumatic brain injury. And there's also the emphasis on resilience and resilience training. So do you see the active duty component at least working at cross purposes to itself, in that it's stressing resilience and sort of can-do attitude, while at this, and that culture sort of working on the individual, yet at the same time they're spending the vast sum of $20 million for suicide hotline?
Yes, you've already said so much of it beautifully, but yes, the military culture that emphasizes this sort of machismo and toughness works at odds with help-seeking attitudes, and that's certainly something we've seen over time. And even when there's forced screening, and they have enhanced that over time, what we've found is that service members tend not to give accurate information. And it does seem part of that is just not wanting to be viewed as weak, and they want to just remain tough, and certainly resilience training would emphasize that. But it is also just a fear of not wanting to lose your job. I've spoken with many veterans about this very issue, and many of the ones who had a difficult time sort of transitioning back to the civilian world were the ones who were screened for having a mental health problem or having a physical trauma that would prevent them from continuing to serve. And then a lot of the post-traumatic stress, and if they have feelings of moral injury after service, that moment of being sort of pushed out of the military was the inciting incident. Presumably it's also whatever caused the issue that got them screened out in the first place, but they would really emphasize that piece. And so I do think something important for us to consider when thinking about what we might do to combat this issue is, we have to come at this from different angles, because simply screening, there is obviously a big motivation for service members to not tell the truth. And then they have this sort of trauma of being forced out of the military. So I think increasing help-seeking attitudes up front would make a tremendous difference, and that might require sort of overhauling, or at least reframing, parts of military culture that say that, being the tough guy is the only way to be.
Mm-hmm. But I have a question now about what this categorization is. So if people are pushed out, are they then dishonorably discharged, or can they get an honorable discharge?
They can, they would either, yes, it would be an honorable discharge, or they'd be medically retired, basically.
Okay, medically retired. But then what about people who are dishonorably discharged? And I imagine you could be dishonorably discharged because you are suffering from trauma, or have a traumatic brain injury, and you do something stupid like mouth off to your commanding officer, get involved in too many fights, and so on. So the dishonorably discharged, are they in these statistics? Because I understand they're not treated by the VA. Or maybe that's wrong. Maybe you can correct me on that.
No, if you're dishonorably discharged, then that you wouldn't be included in that. Well, if you look at the VA report, they do separate it from who is actually using VA healthcare and who is not. And the general veteran statistic would include people dishonorably discharged. But that is an interesting angle to look at, because you would wonder how. So the rates among suicide rates among those who do not use VA healthcare are higher, and it would be interesting then to consider how much of that is, geographical limitations, or just not wanting to use the VA, and how much of it would be that they were veterans but they did not have access to the VA in that regard. I would need to look more into that specifically, though.
Right. There seems to be a way to do that quantitatively, but maybe also in terms of process tracing, who's got access to what services. At this juncture, we have reached the end of our time, and I thank you very much for a very interesting hour that you explored these questions with us. And it's unfortunate that this is such a distressing subject. And if anybody wants to use those resources, perhaps, Ben, you could just tell us those numbers again.
Yes. So for the Veteran and Military Crisis Line, the number is 1-800-273-8255, and then you press 1. And if you're in need of immediate assistance, please dial 911.
Right, of course. And we know what happens when they come. They'll help you, we hope. Okay, so thanks so much. And maybe we'll see some of you or all of you next week when we talk about the long-term costs of America's of paying for the veterans of post 9/11 wars, of which I think there are about going to be 5 million or more. So that's next week, between 12 and 1 p.m. on Thursday the 29th. But thank you so much, Ben. So a virtual clap to you.
Thank you very much.